I don't even know what we were counting on somehow. I think everybody was counting on that life is so long that something would happen, you know. We had already got ourselves thrown outside the circle of normal Soviet existence. We could not be like normal, like our parents, like engineers or like, you know, like we basically had marginalized ourselves beyond the point of no return. But by that time, I had already applied to immigrate and had already been turned down in that application. And so I was just, you know, when you are that young in your early 20s, you know, you can wait, you can think that you can wait life out, more or less, you know, just anything can happen. You know, life is long, something is going to happen. Although we would never have foreseen, I would have to say, probably back then in early to mid 80s, that the Soviet Union would actually cease to exist so so soon and would fall apart so irrevocably. We somehow had thought that this menacingly rumbling machine would go on for for decades, would definitely would outlive us. But then, really, you know, we didn't particularly care. Maybe there would be like aliens coming down, you know, just then all bets would be off, you know, just or meteorite would hit like you know Moscow or Leningrad, and then who cares? Well, we were waiting for life to take its course because life, when you're in your early 20s, is absolutely endless, and you don't particularly care. And so, what horrified my parents, for instance, the fact that you know I failed to follow in their footsteps and become like ordinary member of upper middle class of Soviet society, and it would be very hard for me to or impossible for me to get back into that circle. I didn't particularly care about that.
Were they
Uh,
horrified about what would happen to you, or were they horrified about
they
what
were
you were actually saying?
no, they didn't particularly care. They were not political. They were apolitical. They were listening to foreign radio stations, which were severely jammed by the KGB frequencies. You know, in the middle of the night. They of course knew what a massive sham the whole thing, the Soviet Union was. But they also, as people much older than me, they saw this as you know as something that has potential to go on for much longer than human life. So they were worried, and justifiably, that I would never find my way back into the mainstream of Soviet life and would not live like just an ordinary life like my father, like my mother, fairly comfortable by Soviet standards in a society where money was not really the driving force of the society. But routine, and you're standing in the society and occupying your own slot in the society, and that's they were horrified by me having just completely taking myself out of that round of ordinary Soviet life and living on the margins of life. We sort of like already belong to a generation that did not have the mortal fear of being killed, for instance, or thrown in Gulag, which is, you know, the system of camps in the Soviet Union under Stalin, or in jail. You had to actually seriously go out of your way to become a major nuisance to the KGB, and then they would, of course, you know, if you overstepped a certain boundary, then they would, you know, oblige you, and they would put you in jail or in trial. But you really had to go out of your way for that to happen. Otherwise, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted within, and everybody knew the bounds of where they could operate. Everybody knew that we live in a hostile environment. Everybody knew that we essentially lived on an occupied territory, even though it was our country. Everybody knew that, but we knew how to live in that. Milieu. We knew that unlike in our parents or especially grandparents' times, they would not be like cars at night, always at night. You know, stopping somewhere in the courtyard, and then there are steps on the um, on the staircase outside in your apartment building, and you would just pray to God, which you couldn't do because it was an atheist country. Just that those steps would not just cease right outside your door, right? Because that would mean the end of your life essentially. But they would, fortunately, the steps go on and another flight of stairs, and that means that somebody else's life will be ruined tonight. not yours. So, but that fear that was implicit in the lives, ever present in the lives of my grandparents' generation, of course, and to some extent my parents, who were in their 20s under Stalin, which when everything was considerably more horrible. We already kind of belonged to this generation that sort of like didn't particularly care, because we knew that they, other than deprive us of middle life, of a middle class kind of life, then they couldn't do much to us unless we tried hard to irritate them. We all knew that we lived in a make believe world, that we were, and there were strict limitations on what we could or could not do, and the only crime we'd ever committed was to have been born in that country, basically, because once you're born there, you belong to the country, and then you cannot leave it without the state's permission. So it was in a way, it was, well, it was a jail. It was more like a combination of kindergarten and very severe boot camp, this kind of, people were being very treated like children, which was what they were, because the state owned everything. You couldn't really own anything. Well, you could own a car, but you had to wait like several years in line to get the right permission to buy a car. But you could not, strictly speaking, own an apartment in the city, because all the buildings were owned by the state. You could not own a store, you couldn't have a business, you couldn't carry foreign currency. For that, you would go to jail. You could not have in your possession banned books that were not approved ideologically by the state. Very wide range of books of anti-Soviet content, and that would, for instance, well, even Nabokov, for instance, who was an emigre writer. We all kind of knew instinctually how to survive and how to live there. So, if I started out graduating from Leningrad Shipbuilding University with a degree in electromagnetic engineering, and I spent a little bit of time in this outfit of Secret Research Institute that was preoccupied with making Soviet submarines less detectable by America, by sonars and radars, and so forth. But then I dropped out of that by fairly ingenious ways. I managed to escape that, and then I plunged into the very bottom of Soviet life, which is to say, I became a night guard, security guard at this just park of culture and leisure, which is like Six Flags or something. So I was just basically, I was a night guard, and I had to keep my eye on the roller coaster. And all of us were in the same position. It was a generation of highly educated young people who were either security guards or nighttime boiler room operators. In other words, any kind of job that required nothing of you. Of course, it was not about making money, because we mainly lived off of um, having recycling bottles in our apartments. And so, but it gave you a lot of spare time. In the Soviet Union, you see, at that time, you did not have the right not to be employed.